time ago, I've been reviewing some games from the Ridge Racer franchise, first being the original Ridge Racer released for the PS1 in 1994 in Japan. And while it hasn't aged well compared to our other racing peers, it was still an important game for the system and was a decent port in its own right. Then I reviewed Ridge Racer Revolution, released in 1995 in Japan, and it was a significant improvement over the original. It had original courses which were very pleasant to drive around, and it had more content, with new cars like the Angel car and the Devil Kid car, among other things. Then Ridge Racer came around in 1996, and in my opinion it was my favorite Ridge Racer game from the PS1 era. It had some features that were ahead of its time. For example, it was one of the first racing games that features some RPG elements like the ability to buy cars and earn cash by winning races, as well as having the ability to customize your car, even if that feature was somewhat limited compared to the other racers after its release. Nevertheless, I still find Ridge Racer a pretty good game. Though some people say it's almost exactly the same thing, I myself would disagree with that. Some people overlook a lot of the features that Ridge Racer had. I mean, sure, the core gameplay is identical to its predecessors, but it had features that were innovating at the time. Which leads us to the topic of today's video.
Ridge Racer Type 4.
The game was once again made by Namco and released in 1998 in Japan and 1999 overseas. Out of all the classic Ridge Racer games that I've played, Type 4 wasn't the one I remember that much as a kid. I've played Ridge Racer Revolution and Ridge Racer a lot using a PS1 emulator known as EPXXE. Yeah, before we had DuckStation and Madlittlepixel, we had this bad boy when it came to PSX emulation. Nowadays, it's pretty dated since DuckStation exists, but it was a decent emulator at the time. Anyways, as an adult, I started to play Ridge Racer Type 4 and it was actually pretty good. But why was it so good? Well, let's find out in this review. Upon firing this bad boy, we are introduced to this amazing FMV by PS1 standards. As we can see, it depicts Ridge Racer's mascot Reiko Nagase, which her model was improved from Ridge Racer, which, don't get me wrong, her model in the previous game was decent in its own merits, though her design in Ridge Racer Type 4 is actually the most iconic in the franchise. The FMV also depicts the 4 cars that we're going to use in the game, and each of them belong in a different racing team, and I'm not gonna lie, the music is pretty top notch. After watching that, we get to the main menu, where we can choose the following modes: Grand Prix, Time Trial, and VS Battle. Grand Prix is the main meat and potatoes of the game, similar to Ridge Racer. However, this time around, rather than doing races and earning cash to buy new cars and upgrading them, in Ridge Racer Type 4, it's rather very unique. This time around, you can choose one of the 4 racing teams, and they are Racing Team Sovalo, Dig Racing Team, Pack Racing Club, and RC Micro Mouse Mappy. As you can tell from the naming of these teams, they are based upon popular Namco arcade titles like Xevious, Pac-Man, Dig Dug, and Mouse Mappy. It doesn't end there though. After selecting your racing team, you can choose from 4 different car makers: Assoluto, Auge, Lizard, and Tarazi. Each racing team has its own story, giving the Grand Prix mode more of a unique flavor to it. Unlike in Ridge Racer, where you had to work yourself up in order to buy new cars, here it's about your racing team and bringing it to victory. The Grand Prix mode revolves around racing the real racing routes 99 across 8 tracks. The championship is divided into 3 heats. The first heat where you race with lower tier cars, the second heat where you race with mid tier cars, and the final heat is where you race with high tier cars. What mid or high tier car you get is clearly up to the position you've qualified during the races, which I'll talk about later. If you beat the championship mode of the game, you will also unlock a new mode named Extra Trial, where you face against one of the most powerful vehicles in the game. Now, which car you will face is clearly up which car maker you choose in that championship mode. For example, if you completed the game with an Assoluto car, then on that new mode, you'll face against the most powerful car from that car maker, so on and so forth. But what about the controls? Well, I'm happy to say that Ridge Racer Type 4 has polished the controls as well as its dreaded collision detection from Ridge Racer, which in that game, sometimes it was very jarring. It felt much easier to drift than in the previous games. Not to say that the drifting mechanics from the previous games were bad, they were fine, but sometimes you have a feeling that your car wouldn't get out of its drifting state when getting out of a corner. But here it feels much more responsive. It doesn't end there though. For the first time ever, Ridge Racer Type 4 is the first Ridge Racer game that supports the DualShock controller. Other games from the franchise didn't support that, given they were released before the DualShock controller was even a thing. It also supports the forgotten controller known as the JogCon. The JogCon was bundled with the game in some of the limited editions of it. It kind of functions similar to the Netcon, however with the addition of force feedback. The way you control your car is using this dial to maneuver the car during the race. It's a very weird controller to say the least, but it does support some few games like V-Rally 2 and Pac-Man World. Personally, the best way to play this game is still using the Netcon controller if you're using DuckStation, or using a DualShock controller if you're playing it on a real console. In addition, some car makers have different handling attributes. For instance, the Assoluto and Lizard cars have a tendency to drift more frequently, whereas the AG and Tarazi cars have a lot of grip, making cornering much easier and suitable for beginners. Not to mention that the racing teams are tied to difficulty skill, with Dig Racing Team being the hardest and RC Micro Mouse Mappy being the easiest. This means that if you choose RC Micro Mouse Mappy, your adventure will be much easier, whereas choosing Dig Racing Team will make your adventure much harder to win. However, for me, the difficulty in Ridge Racer Type 4 is much more softer than in the previous titles. But that's only because I have the experience of 4,000 years of racing skills, and I perfected the art of Ridge Racer for a long time. Now, this didn't make my experience with Racer Type 4 bland or repetitive, because the core gameplay is pretty solid. Ridge Racer Type 4 has 8 tracks, more than what the other games had, and best of all is that each track was different from one another. Unlike in other games where it had only one track but with different extensions depending on what difficulty you were in. In Ridge Racer Type 4, it's completely the opposite, as each track felt like a unique, interesting experience and it never felt boring to drive around. I used to say that Ridge Racer's courses were among my favorite in the franchise. However, upon playing this game more and more, I realized that Ridge Racer Type 4's tracks were better than I thought. They felt majestic and the aesthetics were pretty top notch. As a result, I feel like Ridge Racer Type 4's tracks are amongst my favorites in the franchise. And once you complete the Grand Prix, you will unlock the reverse versions of the tracks, which are only available on multiplayer and Time Attack. That's not to say Ridge Racer tracks are bad. They were pretty decent on their own merits, they had a more realistic approach and the attention to detail was pretty good. However, they had no chance against Type 4's courses in terms of quality and then some. When it comes to cars, Type 4 has some of the best car designs in the game, ranging from electric, muscle cars to even a fucking futuristic tank of all things, which is always a nice addition. In Ridge Racer, there were only 13 cars. Can you guess how many cars Ridge Racer Type 4 has? 320 cars! Now, you might be thinking, how the hell they shoved up 320 cars in the game? The game was released 2 years after Ridge Racer. How could they do that? Well, the funny thing is that over 60% of the car roster in the game are mostly upgraded variants of the same car, or even cars that are the same except with a different racing team attached to them. Now, remember when I said what mid or high tier car you get is clearly up to the position you've qualified during your races? Well, this is where it gets really weird. If you qualify in first place on every race, you'll earn the best car possible for whichever heat you are, whether it being first, second, or the final heat. This actually motivates newcomers to get better in order to obtain better cars and to increase their win rate. In the first heat, you have to place at least third place, second place on heat 2, and first place on the final heat. Getting third place in the first 2 races grants you the same car but upgraded for the second heat. Getting second place will grant you a better car, so on and so forth. While on paper it sounds interesting, and like I said before, it motivates newcomers to get better in the game and to unlock more cars, for me it's a convoluted mess. For me, as someone who has mastered this game many times, I felt the way you unlock the cars was idiotic to say the least, because forcing myself to qualify for a lower rank in each race to get a different car is total nonsense. If I had a way to fix that, it's actually unlock all the cars from the manufacturer and race the team after beating the championship and reaching first on every race. Let's say for example I pick Team Salvalo and then pick Assoluto as my car maker, and then reaching the first place in every race. Not only would I win the trophy, but I also would have unlocked all the 20 cars of that car maker and that racing team. That would be a more convenient way to get all the cars in the game. But you'll be doing this with just one racing team. There are 4 racing teams in total, and since there's 80 cars each, 20 of each car maker, as well as doing the extra trails, to unlock the fastest car in the game, you'll be grinding a lot, no matter what. I can understand that placing in 3rd or 2nd will make the story dialogue change a bit, so it kinda makes sense that this exists. However, for me, whenever I win the game with all the racing teams and car makers, I just go to the cheat section and unlock every car that I haven't unlocked, thus saving a lot of time grinding. In the Japanese version of the game, it had Pocket Station support in the form of trading cars, which was an interesting novelty at the time. Sadly, this was never featured in the American and European versions of the game. I wonder why. And what do you get for unlocking 320 cars? Well, you unlock the Pac-Man car, which I find hilarious because it's literally a Namco game. There has to be a Pac-Man cameo somewhere. Another flaw that I found is that aside from Grand Prix and Extra Trial mode, there is no single race option. It would have been nice to have that option for custom races, and also allowing us to battle our opponents in the reverse section of the tracks. Speaking of reverse mode, one thing that I wish Grand Prix had was also the option to race around the reverse section of the courses to have more spice to the mode. That being said, these are just minor nitpicks, and in my opinion, the game is still superb despite these flaws. One thing that Type 4 improved upon the previous games was that it finally has split screen multiplayer. In my video of Rage Racer, I've talked about the lack of multiplayer kinda ruined the replay value of the game. Here, it's not the case, and it really increases the replay value of the game. Now, you no longer have to buy unnecessary accessories like 2 copies of the game, 2 TVs, 2 consoles, and a link cable, making the experience much more convenient. Speaking of link cables, Type 4 actually lets you play multiplayer mode with 4 players with a link cable, which is very unique and interesting. This 4-player feature was also present in some other games like Toka 2 and Wipeout 3. Back when Type 4 was released in 1998, everyone was mind-blown with the graphics of the game. I don't know how Namco pulled it off, but somehow they made the prettiest game in their catalog, and even giving Gran Turismo 1, which at the time it was one of the most graphically impressive games in the console, a big run for its money. The game is also the first in the series to use garage shading for its graphics, and it clearly shows just how great the lighting and the atmosphere is. I mean, in my honest opinion, it's easily the prettiest game on the console, pushing it to its maximum limits, even putting other games like GT2 and the Spiral trilogy to shame. It doesn't end there though. With DuckStation, you can upscale the graphics at 4K and fix the polygon wobbling that all the PS1 games had. Oh, you can also add a widescreen hack to it as well. As you can see, in some ways, when playing it upscale at 4K, it almost feels like a very early PS2 title. Damn, this game looks so fucking impressive, I cannot overstate that. Oh, you thought the graphics were amazing? The soundtrack is also so damn good. The soundtrack was composed once again by Hiroshi Okubo and Tetsukazu Nakanishi. This time around, other composers were involved during the creation of this game: Kota Takashi, Asuka Sakai, and Koji Nakaogawa. All of these three new composers of this game also composed soundtracks from other games like Ace Combat 2, Tekken Dark Resurrection, Soul Calibur 2, and Time Crisis. In my review of Ridge Racer, I mentioned that the soundtrack of that game was easily, in my opinion, the best of the franchise, and I mentioned that the Type 4's soundtrack was kinda forgettable. However, after that, I realized that as I was playing the game more and more, the soundtrack was growing up on me and I've started to like the soundtrack even more. Unlike in Ridge Racer, Type 4 explored music styles encompassing funk, breakbeat, acid jazz, UK garage, progressive house, and neo soul mixed with traditional Namco style synth melodies. Here's some songs. As for the sound effects, they have also been improved as well, and they sound like real cars at the time when this game was released. We're not done yet. Ridge Racer Type 4 had a bonus disc that contained several demos from some Namco games like Klonoa, Tekken 3. However, it also contains an updated version of Ridge Racer named Ridge Racer Turbo in North America or High Spec in Europe and Japan. Now, you might be wondering, what's so special about this version? See, this version actually runs at a true 60 frames per second as well as running at 480i as opposed to 240p in the original PS1 version. Now, keep in mind, it's essentially just an interesting tech demo, but a great one at that. During the development of Type 4, they were intended making the game run at 60 frames per second. Sadly, this procedure was too difficult for the developers since they would need to sacrifice or compromise a lot of things in order to run at that speed. However, it wasn't all bad though, as the technology developed by the team is preserved in Ridge Racer Turbo. Essentially, Ridge Racer Turbo is almost exactly the same as the vanilla version. but there's only time trial and time attack mode, meaning you could only face one opponent, but that's to be expected given the sacrifices needed in order to achieve these desired results. Compared to the original version, it feels much smoother and even crispier due to its increased resolution. Granted, it runs on an interlaced resolution that being 480i, it might be more blurrier than the vanilla version, but on DuckStation it's actually more detailed since it handles interlacing perfectly. I feel like Ridge Racer Turbo was meant to show what the future of racing games would look like, and I feel like they were totally confident once the PS2 arrived and achieving the dream they wanted, creating a racing game at 60 frames per second, and that game was Ridge Racer 5. You could say in an odd way, Ridge Racer Turbo could be a prototype for what was about to come in the future, as a beta test for Ridge Racer 5, and since the PS2 was much more powerful than the PS1, they knew it was powerful enough to satisfy their dreams. The hat trick wasn't enough for the Ridge Racer franchise. Once again, they have outdone themselves with Type 4. Its gameplay core has been significantly improved, fixing some issues with the collision detection as well as perfecting the art of drifting, which made that gameplay mechanic much easier to pull off. Sure, it did have some flaws. The way you unlock cars in Grand Prix is kinda dumb, at least for me, no single race mode and some other things. Nevertheless, the pros outweighed the cons, especially with the gameplay core being perfected, and I enjoyed playing Grand Prix mode as it was a lot of fun. With the game finally having split screen multiplayer, having some of the best graphics ever in the PS1 game, and even a banging soundtrack that is pleasing to hear. Overall, Type 4 is clearly one of the greatest PS1 games of all time. And you might be wondering, John, which is the better Ridge Racer game, Ridge Racer or Type 4? Well, my answer would be, why not both? Ridge Racer and Type 4 are both great games, and while their gameplay mechanics are similar, their execution are quite different to each other. Ridge Racer implemented some RPG elements that most modern day racing games have today, like buying cars and upgrade them, but Ridge Racer Type 4 was one of the first racing games that had a story mode. Sure, it's not as complex as other games of different genres that had a storyline, but still it was simple and easy to understand, and best of all, it perfected the driving mechanics of the franchise, not to mention it pushed the PS1 to its absolute limits with its impressive graphics. As a result, I love them both, and it's pretty impossible to decide which one is the best classic Ridge Racer game. Both of them are some of the best PS1 games of all time.